When you picture surviving a brutal winter on the frontier, you think about fire. Firewood stacked to the eaves, a stove glowing red, smoke pouring from the chimney day and night. More fuel, more heat, more burning. That is how everyone in the valley thought about it too. But the thing that killed people was not the absence of heat. It was the speed at which their shelters gave the heat back. Wind did not care how large the fire was. It stripped warmth from a cabin the way a river strips soil from a bank, constantly and visibly faster than anything inside could replace it. 600 years before any settler arrived, someone had already solved this problem, and a 15-year-old girl with no fire, no food, and no one coming to help was about to find their answer carved into the side of a cliff. The San Miguel Mission. Home for Foundlings sat in a shallow draw 2 miles east of Macalmo Canyon, and the building had not been warm since October. It was November of 1887, and the stove in the main hall cracked along the firebox seam sometime during the second week of the month, leaking smoke into the room where 14 children slept on straw ticks, pushed against the walls. The county had sent $4 for repairs. Vernon Quill, superintendent, had spent 3 of those dollars on lamp oil and whiskey in Cortez and logged the full amount against stove maintenance and child welfare supplies in his black ledger. Mara Bellamy had been at the home for 11 months. She was 15, thin across the shoulders, strong in the hands from laundry work, and quiet in the way that made adults forget she was listening. She had arrived the previous December on a freight wagon from Durango, transferred from a placement house in St. Louis after her mother died of typhoid, and her father disappeared following a rail-cut collapse near the river. The placement agent's letter described her as tractable, literate, suited for domestic service. Mara had read the letter through the agent's coat pocket while he slept on the train. What the letter did not say was that Mara's father had been a stonecutter, not a quarryman swinging hammers at a face, but a cutter, a man who understood the grain of limestone, the way sandstone fractured along its bedding planes, the particular warmth that south-facing rock held after the sun dropped behind the bluffs along the Mississippi. He had taught Mara one thing she carried like a stone in her chest. Press your palm flat against rock after sunset, and the rock will tell you what the sun did that day. Warm stone meant the sun had spoken to it. Cold stone meant shadow had owned it. The difference, her father said, was the difference between a house that lived and a house that died. She had not understood what he meant. She was 9 when he said it, standing in a rail cut with orange light pooling on the walls and iron dust in her teeth. 2 years later, he was gone, buried or broken under a collapse that the railroad called an act of providence and paid nothing for. Now she stood in the orphanage yard with sleet collecting in her hair and a dog jammed under her coat. Bristle was a terrier mix, brown and white, wiry, with one ear that folded and one that stood. Mara had pulled him from a freight yard litter in Durango and smuggled him into the home inside a flour sack. For 11 months she had hidden him under her cot, fed him scraps from her own plate, and kept him silent during Quill's inspections by pressing her hand over his muzzle and whispering the only prayer she believed in, which was not a prayer at all, but a promise. I will not let them take you. Quill found the dog on the 4th of November. He found him because Mara made a mistake. She left Bristle in the laundry shed while she carried sheets to the drying line, and the dog scratched at the door loud enough for Quill to hear from the porch. Quill opened the door, saw the dog standing on a pile of soiled linens, and did not yell. That was worse than yelling. Quill closed the door, walked to his office, and wrote something in his ledger. Then he sent a younger boy to fetch Mara. She came with the sheets still damp in her arms, and she knew before she reached the porch. Quill stood at the top of the steps with his coat buttoned to the neck and his ledger open against his forearm. Behind him, Marshal Eben Vowell sat on the bench near the door, cleaning his pipe. Vowell had come to inspect the stove after a child nearly fainted from coal smoke the previous night. He was 61, a former Army freighter, thick across the chest, and careful with his words in the way of men who had seen enough trouble to know that most of it was caused by talking. Quill did not waste a sentence on greeting. He said, "You have stolen food from this institution to feed a diseased animal. You have hidden county property under your cot, and you have lied to me for 11 months." Mara said nothing. She felt Bristle's ribs moving against her stomach under the coat. She had scooped him from the laundry shed before coming to the porch because she understood what Quill's silence meant. Quill produced a folded paper from his coat. "This is your indenture agreement. County of Montezuma holds custody. I hold placement authority. A girl with no people has no road but the one I give her." Vowel looked at the paper, then at Mara. He did not intervene. Quill said the dog would go to the tanner by morning. He said Mara would spend the night in the coal shed for theft of food and insubordination. He said that if she caused further trouble, he would place her with a ranch family 40 miles south. A sheepman named Garrett who needed a girl for kitchen and laundry and who did not return children who failed to satisfy. Ada Trask stood behind the doorframe, watching. She was 16, sharp-faced, with bitten nails and a bruise along her jaw that she claimed came from a door. Ada had known about Bristle for months and had said nothing to Quill because silence was the only currency orphan girls could spend. Now she caught Mara's eye and shook her head once. The message was clear: do not fight him here. Mara did not fight. She let Quill take her by the arm and walk her across the yard to the coal shed, a stone and timber box 8 feet square with a rotten plank door and no window. The floor was packed dirt covered in coal dust. The air tasted like char. Quill pushed her inside and dropped the latch. She heard his boots cross the yard. She heard Vowel say something low and flat that she could not make out. She heard the main door close. Then she heard Bristle scratching. The dog had not been taken. Quill assumed Bristle was still in the laundry shed, but Mara had him under her coat, and in the confusion of the walk to the coal shed, Quill had not checked. Bristle squirmed free and dropped to the dirt floor, circling, sniffing the baseboards. Mara pressed her back against the stone wall and felt the cold move through her dress into her spine. She had 2 biscuits in her apron pocket, stolen from supper before Quill's summons. She had 1 tin cup she carried everywhere because a girl without a cup at the home drank from her hands or did not drink. She had a shawl, thin and fraying, wrapped around her shoulders. She had a 3-foot length of rope end that she had cut from a hay bale cord weeks ago and kept in case she ever needed to tie something. She had a chipped stone button from her father's coat, smooth on one side, rough on the other, that she rubbed when she could not sleep. She had nothing else. Outside, the sleet turned to freezing drizzle. The temperature was dropping. Mara could feel it in the way the stone wall behind her shifted from cold to colder, the warmth draining out of it like water through sand. 14 children slept in the main hall with a cracked stove, 2 sacks of coal dust, and half a cord of damp pinon that Quill had not bothered to split. The front moving in from the northwest would reach the canyon before dawn. Bristle stopped circling. He stood at the base of the wall where it met the floor and pushed his nose against a gap. The rotten sill board had pulled away from the foundation stone, leaving a space perhaps 10 inches high and 14 inches wide. Mara could see a faint gray line of outside light. The dog looked at her. She looked at the gap. She looked at the latched door. She thought about Quill's hand on her arm and the ranch 40 miles south and the tanner's yard where Bristle would end. She thought about the coal shed floor and the 14 children and the stove that leaked smoke instead of heat. She thought about her father pressing her palm to warm stone in a rail cut and saying, "The rock remembers." Bristle pushed his head through the gap, then his shoulders, then his hips. He was outside in 4 seconds. Mara heard him shake on the other side of the wall. She lay flat on the coal dust floor and began to dig. The gap was too narrow. Mara used her tin cup to scrape at the packed dirt beneath the sill, working in the dark, filling her nails with grit and coal. The stone foundation above the gap held firm, but the earth below it was soft from years of drainage running along the wall. She dug for what felt like an hour. It might have been 20 minutes. Time in the coal shed had no markers. When the gap was wide enough, she pushed her shawl through first, then the rope end, then the cup. She exhaled everything in her lungs and pulled herself through on her stomach, feeling the sill board scrape across her shoulder blades hard enough to tear cloth. For 3 seconds she was stuck, the weight of the wall above her and the frozen ground below, and she could not breathe and she could not move, and she thought, "This is where they find me in the morning, half in and half out, frozen." Then Bristle licked her face, and she twisted sideways. and the rotten wood gave just enough. She came through. The orphanage yard was empty. The main hall windows showed a dim glow from the stove. Quill had not yet gone to bed. Vowel's horse was tied at the front rail. The sleet had stopped, replaced by a freezing mist that turned everything gray and close. Mara could see perhaps 30 yards. Beyond that, the canyon rim was invisible. She had no plan beyond the next step, and the next step was away. Mara wrapped the shawl around Bristle to keep him from shaking, tucked him under her arm, and walked south toward the wash that ran along the base of the mesa. She stayed off the wagon road because wagon roads were where people looked for runaways. She followed the drainage ditch instead, stumbling over frozen ruts. Her boots, orphanage boots, thin-soled, too large, stuffed with rags at the toes, sliding on the iced mud. By the time she reached the wash, the mist had thickened into something between fog and drizzle. She was wet through. Bristle had stopped shaking, which frightened her more than the shaking had, because she knew from the home that when a cold animal stopped shivering, it meant the body was giving up the argument. She pressed against a sandstone ledge at the wash's edge and put Bristle inside her coat against her chest. His heartbeat was fast and small. She could feel his ribs like the teeth of a comb. Above her, the ledge jutted out 3 feet, blocking the drizzle. The rock face behind her was rough, pitted, streaked red and tan. Mara leaned against it and felt the cold push through the stone into her back. Then she moved. She slid 2 feet to her left, to where the ledge face angled slightly south, and pressed her palm flat. The stone was not warm. It was not anything close to warm, but it was warmer than the exposed shale she had leaned against first. The difference was small. The difference between ice and cold water, between numb and aching, but it was there. And Mara knew what it meant because her father had taught her to feel for it in a rail cut 7 years ago. South-facing stone held the sun's heat longer. The overhang protected it from wind. The mass of rock behind the face stored warmth the way a cast-iron stove stored warmth, slowly, deeply, releasing it hour by hour into the air, touching its surface. Houses were not the only shelters. Shape mattered. Direction mattered. Stone remembered. She did not know yet what this meant in practice. She did not know that 30 miles to the west, the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde held rooms that stayed warmer than any settler cabin on the mesa top. She did not know that the ancestral Pueblo people had chosen south-facing alcoves for exactly the reason her father had pressed her hand to warm limestone. She knew only that the exposed wash would kill her and bristle before morning, that the wagon road led back to Quill, and that this ledge, this small, angled, south-facing shelf of sandstone, was less cold than everything around it. She curled against the wall, pulled Bristle tight, and waited for the sky to lighten. Dawn came gray and grudging. The freezing drizzle had stopped, but the air held a metallic bite that Mara had learned to associate with worse weather coming. In St. Louis, that taste in the air meant ice storms within a day. Here, in McElmo Canyon, she did not know what it promised, but the birds were wrong. Ravens that normally circled the mesa rim had dropped low, hugging the canyon walls. A magpie sat on a dead juniper with its feathers puffed, motionless, facing south. Mara's body told her what the ravens already knew. She was cold in a way that had moved past shaking into a deep, still ache in her joints. Her dress was damp, her shawl was wet. Her boots had soaked through overnight, and her feet had gone from painful to wooden. Bristle moved when she shifted, which meant he was alive, but he did not stand. She had 2 biscuits. She broke one in half and gave half to Bristle, who ate it in 2 bites. She ate the other half slowly, letting the dry crumbs sit on her tongue because swallowing hurt. The biscuit was hard, stale, made from weevilled flour. It was the best food she had. She needed to move. The problem was direction. South along the wash led eventually to the Dolores River and then to ranches where people might take her in or might send her back to Quill. East led to open mesa, exposed to wind with no water and no cover. North led to the orphanage. West led deeper into McElmo Canyon, where the walls narrowed and the sandstone cliffs rose 400 feet, and the goat trails that Hispano and Diné herders used climbed into places the town called forbidden. Mara knew about the goat trails because of Talwai Yazi. She had met Talwai in September, when the old woman brought goats through the wash below the orphanage. Mara had been sent to dump wash water and found Talwai's goats drinking from the seep. Instead of chasing them, Mara had carried water to the trough. Talwai watched her from the bank and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "You check stone like your hands know something." Mara had been pressing her palm to the trough wall, testing the warmth without thinking. It was a habit her father had built into her muscles. She told Talwai about the rail cut, about her father's hands, and the way he could tell which face of a quarry had seen sun by touch alone. Talwai said, "Good. Most people trust their eyes. Stone talks to hands." Over 3 weeks in September and early October, Talwai returned to the wash 4 times. She was 64, Diné, a widow who herded goats and traded wool, and knew the canyon paths the way a riverboat pilot knew the channel. She did not befriend Mara in any soft way. She taught her things, briefly and practically, the way you teach a person you recognize as capable of learning. First lesson: wind reading. Throw dust low, not high. Canyon wind moves along the floor before it rises. If dust swirls at your knees, the wind will hit your face in a count of 10. Second lesson: water reading. Green stain beneath sandstone means a seep. Where rock layers meet, sandstone over shale, limestone over clay, water collects. Third lesson, and the one Talwai repeated: the old cliff houses belonged to living peoples, not ghosts, not treasure. "You step where the stone already accepts feet," she said. "You do not open what is not yours." Mara asked once if the cliff houses were warm. Talwai looked at her for a long time and said, "The people who built them knew where the sun went." That was all. Talwai left in mid-October to move her goats toward winter pasture near Shiprock. She did not say goodbye in any way Mara recognized. She simply did not come back. Now Mara stood at the wash with a wet dog and a biscuit and a half, and the memory of an old woman who had told her that stone talked to hands and that ancient builders knew where the sun went. It was not a plan. It was barely an idea. But it was the only direction that did not lead to Quill, exposure, or a stranger's ranch. She turned west into the canyon. Mara did not get far before Ada found her. The older girl appeared at the wash bin carrying a pail of ashes, sent by Quill to dump them before breakfast. Ada saw Mara and stopped. She set the pail down. She looked at the canyon behind Mara, then at the orphanage roof visible above the draw. "He knows you're gone," Ada said. "He checked the coal shed at first light. The sill is broken. He thinks you crawled out." "I did crawl out." "He told Vowel you stole food and ran with a diseased dog. He's talking about sending word to Cortez for a search." Mara said nothing. Bristle stood at her feet, shivering again, nose pointed west. Ada crossed her arms. Her bruise had darkened overnight. She said, "Where are you going to go? The canyon is nothing but walls and goat trails and old dead rooms that nobody enters. You have no fire. You have no blankets. You have no food worth the name." "The cliff is warmer than the shed," Mara said. Ada stared at her. "The cliff is rock. Rock holds heat. South-facing rock holds it longer. Rock doesn't feed you. Rock doesn't testify when they find your body." Ada's voice cracked on the last word. She was not mocking Mara. She was frightened for her, and the fear came out sharp because Ada did not know how to make it come out soft. "Quill told Vowel that one less stubborn girl would save Cole. You think that man will send help? You think anyone in this valley will choose you over his ledger?" Mara touched the chipped stone button in her pocket. She said, "I'm not asking anyone to choose me. I'm choosing the canyon." Ada looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "If Quill asks me, I can hold until nightfall. Maybe. I cannot lie when his hand is on the strap, Mara. I cannot. I know." You're going to die up there. I might die down here. Ada picked up the ash pail. She did not hug Mara or wish her well. She said, "The goat trail starts past the dead juniper where the wash turns. The left fork, not the right. Talwai showed me once when she thought I was brave enough to run." Then she walked back toward the orphanage without turning around. Mara watched her go. The ash pail swung against Ada's leg, leaving gray streaks on her dress. The freezing mist closed behind her. Bristle whined and pulled west. Mara followed. The goat trail was everything Ada had warned about and worse. It started at the dead juniper as a visible path, 8 inches wide, cut into the base of the cliff by generations of hooves. For the first 100 yards, it was manageable, steep but solid, with handholds in the rock where brush roots gripped the cracks. Mara climbed with Bristle ahead of her, the dog's claws finding purchase she could not see. Then the trail narrowed. At the first switchback, the path shrank to 6 inches. The outside edge dropped 15 feet to a talus slope of broken sandstone. Frost had turned the shaded sections glassy. Mara's orphanage boots, smooth-soled and too large, slid on the ice. She grabbed a juniper root and held, her weight swinging over the edge, her feet pedaling against nothing. Bristle came back. He stood above her on the trail, barking once, then leaning down until his nose touched her wrist. Mara pulled herself up using the root and the dog's solid weight as a reference point, not support, but direction. She got her knee on the trail and pressed her forehead to the cold stone and breathed. The second switchback was worse. A section of trail had collapsed, leaving a 3-foot gap bridged by nothing but air. Below the gap, the slope fell 20 feet to rock. Mara studied it for a long time. She could see the trail continuing on the far side, clear and solid. Between her and that trail was emptiness. She used the rope end. She tied it around the thickest juniper root she could reach, tested it with her full weight, and swung across the gap with her free hand clawing at the far edge. Her fingers caught the lip. The rope pulled taut. For 2 seconds she hung between the root and the rock, feet dangling, arms burning. Then she hauled herself up and lay on the far side with her palms bleeding and her heart slamming against her ribs. Bristle crossed the gap in a single jump. The trail climbed for another 200 yards, switching back and forth across the cliff face, always narrow, always exposed on the outer edge. Mara's hands left red smears on the sandstone. Her feet had gone from wooden to painful again, which she knew was better because it meant blood was still moving. At a point roughly 300 feet above the wash, Bristle stopped. The dog stood at a wall of brush, dead scrub oak, dried yucca, and juniper branches piled against a fissure in the cliff face. The pile looked natural, like debris pushed by wind and gravity into a crack, but Bristle did not push through. He stood with his nose pressed to the brush and his tail rigid and his ears forward, scenting something behind the wall. Mara pulled at the brush. The outer layer came away easily, dry, light, crumbling. Behind it, the branches were thicker, woven almost deliberately across the opening. She worked at them until she had cleared a space wide enough for her shoulders. The fissure opened into darkness. Mara could not see what was inside. The air that came through the gap was different, still dry, faintly warm compared to the wind cutting across the trail. She could smell dust, old dust, the kind that had been sitting for decades, and something else beneath it. Soot. Bristles squeezed through. Mara stood at the entrance with the canyon below her, and the freezing mist pressing against her back, and a dog's muffled bark echoing from somewhere inside the cliff. She thought about Talwai's words. You step where the stone already accepts feet. She thought about Quill's men on the lower trail and Ada's promise that would last only until nightfall. She thought about the front coming in from the northwest, and the metallic taste in the air and the ravens hugging the walls. She crawled through the fissure. The passage was narrow for 10 feet, then opened. Mara's eyes adjusted. Light filtered through the brush screen behind her, enough to show shapes. She was standing in a room, not a cave, a room. The ceiling was soot-blackened, curved, shaped by the natural alcove, but smoothed where it met the walls. The walls were built, fitted stone, stacked without mortar, but tight enough that Mara could not push her fingertip between the joints. The floor was packed earth, dusted with sand and fallen plaster. Against the back wall, a stone bench ran the width of the room, shaped from the living rock of the alcove and built up with additional courses. Beyond the first room, she could see openings into more rooms, 5 visible, maybe more in shadow. The alcove mouth, shielded by the brush screen and the cliff overhang, faced roughly south. The opening was nearly 22 feet across. The deepest room sat perhaps 38 feet from the outer drip line. Wind screamed past the cliff face outside. Inside, the dust on the floor did not move. Mara pressed her palm to the back wall. The stone was not warm, but it was not the killing cold of the exposed cliff. It held a memory of the afternoon sun, faint, deep, the kind of warmth that existed in the mass of the rock itself, not on its surface. The overhang blocked wind. The walls blocked drafts. The deep rooms sat nested behind the shallow ones, insulated by stone on 5 sides, with only the screened alcove mouth open to air. She understood in that moment, not with words but with her father's hands, what the ancient builders had done. They had not just chosen shelter from rain, they had chosen the angle of the sun. They had chosen the depth of stone. They had chosen a position where winter light reached the back wall and summer light was blocked by the overhang. They had built rooms inside rooms so that heat moved inward and cold stayed at the threshold. She did not know the words for passive solar design. She did not know that the Department of Energy, a century later, would describe the exact principles she was feeling under her palm. She knew only that the stone remembered the sun, and the rooms kept the memory, and the wind could not spend it. Bristle sat on the stone bench looking at her. His tail moved once. Mara sat down beside him. She ate the last biscuit. She divided it, giving Bristle the larger half because the dog had found the entrance and earned it. She pulled her knees to her chest and pressed her back against the wall and felt the faint, patient warmth of sandstone that had been holding the sun for 600 years. She did not sleep, but she stopped shaking. By midday, Mara had begun to understand the shape of her borrowed shelter, and the shelter had begun to show her what it could not give. The alcove held 5 visible rooms, and a partial 6th collapsed at the far end. The front room, closest to the screened entrance, caught direct sunlight from mid-morning through early afternoon. The stone floor in this room was warmer than any surface Mara had touched since leaving the orphanage. By noon, she could press her palm flat and feel genuine warmth, not the faint memory of it, but actual stored heat radiating back through the rock. The middle rooms were darker, cooler, but still, no wind reached them. The air inside was dry, which mattered more than Mara knew, because wet cold killed faster than dry cold, and the soaked clothing that had been draining her body heat since the previous night began to stiffen and dry against the stone walls. The back room was the deepest, 38 feet from the drip line, with the stone bench built against the rear wall. This room received almost no direct light, but also almost no moving air. It was a pocket. Whatever warmth entered from the front rooms drifted back and settled. Whatever cold pressed against the alcove mouth could not penetrate this far. Mara learned the rooms by touch, running her palms along walls and floors, marking sun patches with charcoal from the soot-blackened ceiling. She found mealing stones, flat grinding surfaces worn smooth, set into a low bench in the second room. She found sealed storage niches in the walls, their openings plugged with fitted stone and dried mud plaster. She found a collapsed ladder pole juniper, cracked but not rotted, leaning against the back wall. She found the seep. The seep was a green-stained line on the wall of the third room, where the sandstone met a layer of denser rock beneath. Water moved through this joint, not flowing, not dripping, but weeping, a slow, steady moisture that collected in a shallow natural basin at the base of the wall. The basin held perhaps a cupful. Mara tasted it, cold, gritty, faintly mineral, clean enough. She filled her tin cup and drank, and the water was the second best thing she had tasted in 11 months after the biscuit she had shared with Bristle. But the shelter could not give her what it did not have. It could not give her fire. Mara had no flint, no steel, no matches. The orphanage had not trusted older children with fire-making tools because Quill kept the matches locked in his office and rationed them like currency. She had the soot-blackened ceiling as proof that the ancient builders had burned fires in these rooms, but she had no way to start one. It could not give her food. The biscuits were gone. The seep gave water, but not sustenance. Mara's stomach had been half empty for months at the orphanage, and now it was entirely empty, and the hollowness was becoming a sound, a thin, high whine behind her ears that she recognized as the first stage of real hunger. It could not give her certainty. The rooms were warmer than the wash, warmer than the coal shed, warmer than the exposed trail. But warmer than deadly was not the same as warm enough to live. The real front had not arrived. The freezing drizzle of the previous night was a warning, not the event. When the full cold came, and Mara could taste it coming in the metallic air, she did not know whether these rooms would hold. She began to work because work was the only answer she had. She cleared loose brush from the entrance but left the densest branches as a windscreen. She stacked fallen stones waist-high across a side crack in the first room where air moved. She dragged dry grass and yucca fiber from outside the entrance into the back room and piled it in a corner for Bristle. She used a pottery shard and her tin cup to scrape frost from the seep basin, widening the collection area by a fraction. Each task was small. Each task was necessary. Each task hurt. Her hands, already cut from the climb, cracked further as she handled rough stone. Her palms left red-brown smears on the walls. Her foot caught on something sharp in the second room, a fragment of black-on-white pottery, painted with geometric lines broken centuries ago. The edge opened a cut across her arch that bled freely into her boot. She tore a strip from her shawl and wrapped it, cursing softly, then stopped. She picked up the pottery shard. It was lighter than she expected, thin-walled, painted with a precision that made her think of her father's best cuts. The ones where the chisel followed the grain so closely that the stone seemed to separate on its own. Someone had made this. Someone had held it. Someone had eaten from it in a room that Mara was now bleeding in. She set the shard on the stone bench carefully, with the painted side up. Talwai's voice in her head said, "You do not open what is not yours." But Mara had not opened anything. She had crawled in because the cold was killing her, and the dog had found the way. She was not treasure hunting. She was breathing. Was breathing theft? She did not have an answer. She went back to work. By late afternoon, she had sealed the side crack with stacked stone and brush, cleared the front room of loose debris, and arranged 3 sleeping zones: the back room for night, the middle room for working, the front room for drying wet clothes and collecting sun heat. She had mapped the sun's path in charcoal marks. First light reached the front room floor, noon warmed the second room wall, late light struck the stone bench in the back room through the aligned doorways. Then, as the last sun angled through the alcove mouth and painted the back wall gold, she saw something that stopped her: a lantern. Far below, on the lower goat trail, swinging in the gray mist. Someone was climbing. Mara pressed against the entrance screen and looked down. She could not see who carried the lantern. She could see the light moving, slow, deliberate, switching back along the trail she had climbed that morning. The light stopped at the collapse section, the 3-foot gap where Mara had swung on her rope end. It stayed there for a long time. Then it turned and descended. Whoever it was could not cross the gap, but whoever it was now knew the trail went somewhere. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever trusted something everyone else dismissed because you saw what they couldn't? Mara pulled back from the entrance and sat in the darkening front room with Bristle pressed against her leg. The sun had left the alcove. The stone was warm under her palms. The air outside was turning from gray to black. Somewhere below, a lantern was descending, and somewhere behind that lantern, Vernon Quill was waiting to hear what the climber found. She had a shelter she did not own. She had water she could not carry. She had no food, no fire, and no way to know whether the walls holding the sun's memory would hold it long enough to keep her alive through what was coming. The wind shifted north. The canyon began to make a sound she had never heard before. a low, sustained moan, as if the rock itself were drawing breath. The front was coming. The first night inside the cliff dwelling did not try to kill Mara. It simply tested whether she was worth keeping. She slept in the back room with Bristle curled against her stomach and her shawl spread beneath them both because the packed earth floor pulled heat from her body faster than the stone walls returned it. She learned this in the first hour. She had laid down on the bare floor and felt the warmth drain out of her like water through a crack. Slow, steady, unstoppable. She rolled onto the shawl. The wool was still damp from the mist, but it was better than dirt. Then she pulled dry grass and yucca fiber around her and Bristle until they were nested in a rough bed that smelled like dust and sage and the long, patient sleep of centuries. She woke before dawn. The air in the back room was cold, but not bitter. Her breath fogged, but only lightly, a thin mist that dissolved 2 inches from her lips. In the coal shed the previous night, her breath had hung in the air like smoke, thick and visible, which meant the air temperature there had been far below freezing. Here the difference was small, but real. The stone walls were doing something. Not enough, maybe, but something. Mara crawled to the front room and looked out through the brush screen. The canyon was gray, silent, still. Frost coated every surface outside the alcove, the trail, the brush, the exposed rock faces across the canyon. Inside the alcove, the floor of the front room was dry. No frost. Mara pressed her palm to the stone bench in the second room and felt it. Cool, not cold. The bench had held the previous afternoon's sun heat through the night. She filled her tin cup at the seep. The water had not frozen. Near the entrance, where she had left a small puddle the night before, a skim of ice had formed. But at the seep itself, 30 feet from the opening, the water was liquid. Not warm, not comfortable, but liquid, which meant the temperature in the deep room had stayed above freezing all night while the canyon outside had dropped well below it. Bristle drank from the cup. Mara drank after him. Her stomach cramped around the cold water, reminding her that water was not food and that she had eaten nothing since yesterday's biscuit. The food problem would kill her before the cold would if she did not solve it. She had seen pinon pines on the trail, small, twisted trees growing from cracks in the cliff face. In September, Talwai had shown her how to find pinon nuts. Look for open cones on the ground beneath the trees, then crack the shells between 2 stones. The nuts were small, oily, dense with energy. Talwai had called them walking food because a handful could carry a person through a day of herding. Mara left Bristle in the back room and climbed out through the fissure onto the trail. The frost made every step dangerous. She moved on her hands and knees where the trail narrowed, pressing her weight into the cliff face, feeling for solid rock before committing. She collected pinon cones from 2 trees within 50 yards of the entrance, stuffing them into her apron until the fabric bulged. She also pulled handfuls of dry grass for bedding and stripped bark from a dead juniper, which she could use as tinder if she ever found a way to make fire. The work took an hour. By the time she crawled back through the fissure, the sun had cleared the eastern rim and was reaching into the alcove mouth. The front room floor was already warming. Mara could feel the difference between the shadowed stone near the entrance and the sunlit stone 6 feet inside. The gap was perhaps 10 degrees. She had no way to measure it, but her palms told her what a thermometer would have confirmed. She cracked pinon shells between 2 stones and ate the nuts slowly, one by one, letting each one sit on her tongue before chewing. They tasted like smoke and fat. She fed Bristle a palmful. The dog ate them and looked at her with his ears forward, asking for more. She gave him 3 more and stopped. There were perhaps 2 cups of nuts in the apron. She needed them to last. The second day brought Quill. Mara heard voices on the lower trail before she saw anyone. Sound carried strangely in the canyon, bouncing off walls, arriving before the source was visible. She pressed against the entrance screen and looked down. 2 men stood at the base of the cliff, 300 feet below. One was Quill. She recognized his coat, black, buttoned to the neck, and the way he stood with his weight on his heels, leaning back as if the world owed him a chair. The other was a man she did not recognize, younger, broad-shouldered, wearing a stockman's hat. A hired man. Quill was pointing up at the cliff face and talking. Mara could not hear his words, but she could hear the tone, clipped, insistent, the voice of a man giving orders he expected followed. The hired man looked up at the cliff, looked at the trail, and shook his head. Quill spoke again, this time louder. Mara caught fragments. The girl... Trail goes up. $2 if you bring her... The hired man said something Mara could not hear. Then he started up the lower trail. He climbed slowly, carefully, using his hands on the rock. He was bigger than Mara and less afraid of the height, but he was also heavier, and the frost-slick trail punished weight. Twice he stopped to kick ice from a foothold. Once he grabbed a bush that pulled free from the rock, and he slid 3 feet before catching himself on a root. Mara watched with her heart hammering against her ribs. The man was approaching the collapsed section, the 3-foot gap where the trail had fallen away. She had crossed it with a rope tied to a juniper root. The root was still there. The rope end was still tied to it. If the man saw the rope, he would know someone had crossed recently. The man reached the gap. He stopped. He looked at the drop below, 15 feet to a talus slope, and he looked at the far side of the trail. He put one boot on the edge and tested it. Loose rock crumbled and fell. Then he saw the rope. He pulled it. The juniper root held. The man wrapped the rope around his fist and leaned forward, putting his weight on it. The root cracked. Not completely. It held barely, but the sound was sharp enough to reach Mara's ears 300 feet above. The man heard it too. He let go of the rope and stepped back. He looked up at the cliff face above the gap. He looked back at Quill, who stood at the base with his arms crossed. The hired man shouted something down. Quill shouted back. The argument was short. The hired man descended. Mara stayed at the entrance screen for another hour, watching. Quill paced at the base of the cliff, kicked a stone, and finally walked back toward the wash with the hired man behind him. Before he disappeared around the bend, he turned and looked up at the cliff one more time. He could not see the fissure. The brush screen was too thick, the angle too sharp, but he stood there for a long time staring at the rock as if he could will it to give up what it was hiding. Then he left. Mara sat down on the front room floor and realized she was shaking, not from cold, from the knowledge that the rope was still tied to the root, and the root was cracking, and the next person who climbed might be lighter or braver, or might bring a better rope. She needed to cut the line. She crawled out to the gap that afternoon, untied the rope end, and stuffed it back in her apron. Without the rope, the gap was uncrossable for anyone who did not know the exact handhold on the far side, where a ledge lip jutted just enough for fingers. Mara knew it because she had found it with her bleeding hands on the way up. No one looking from below would see it. The trail was her moat. The gap was her gate. But gates only held if no one found a way around them. On the third day, Talwai Yazi appeared. Not at the fissure. Mara would not have heard her approach. Talwai moved on canyon rock the way water moved, finding the path that already existed. She appeared at the top of the ridge above the alcove, visible against the gray sky, standing beside 2 goats. She stayed there for a long time, looking down at the cliff face. Mara did not call out. She watched from the entrance screen, hardly breathing. Talwai was studying the brush at the fissure. From above, the disturbance would be visible. Branches pulled aside, a gap in the screen that had not existed before. Talwai would see it the way she saw everything, with hands that understood stone and eyes that read the canyon like text. After several minutes, Talwai descended along a route Mara had not known existed, a narrow seam in the cliff face that ran diagonally from the ridge to a ledge 50 feet above the alcove. She moved without hurry. The goats followed her, picking their way along footholds that seemed impossible for hooved animals. She stopped at the ledge. She did not come to the fissure. She did not enter. Instead, she laid something on a flat stone near the trail, a small bundle wrapped in wool cloth, and placed a piece of sandstone on top to hold it. Then she looked at the brush screen for a long moment. Mara could see her face now, dark, deeply lined, patient. The expression was not angry. It was not surprised. It was something closer to resigned, the way a person looks when the thing they expected to happen has happened, and they must decide how to respond. Talwai turned and climbed back up the seam with her goats. At the ridge, she stopped once more and looked down. Then she was gone. Mara waited until the ridge was empty for a full count of 200 before she climbed out to the ledge. The bundle contained 2 strips of dried mutton, hard and dark, each the length of her hand, a pouch of pinon nuts, already shelled, a bone awl, thin, sharp, the kind used for punching holes in leather, and beneath the food, a flat piece of sandstone with marks scratched into the surface in charcoal. The marks were not English. They were not Diné as far as Mara could tell. They were pictures, a small flame with a line through it, and below it 2 figures, one larger, one smaller, with the larger figure pointing away from the flame. Beside the figures, a rough shape that might have been a cliff or a building, and above it 2 eyes. Mara stared at the stone for a long time. Then she understood. Do not make fire. People are watching. She carried the bundle inside and sat in the back room with the mutton and the pinon and the awl and the warning. Bristle ate a strip of mutton in 3 bites. Mara ate the other strip slowly, tearing it with her teeth, letting the salt and fat dissolve on her tongue. The dried meat was tougher than leather and tasted like smoke and sage, and something she could not name, generosity maybe, or its harder cousin, obligation. Talwai had not entered the dwelling. She had not spoken to Mara. She had left food and a tool and a warning and departed. The message was layered. I know where you are. I will help you live. Do not be seen. Do not make smoke. The warning carried a second meaning that Mara turned over in her mind as the afternoon light moved across the front room floor. Talwai had said the old rooms belonged to living peoples. Smoke, rising from a cliff dwelling that the town believed was haunted and empty, would draw exactly the kind of attention that neither Mara nor Talwai wanted. Treasure hunters, curiosity seekers, men who would strip the rooms for pottery and sell it in Durango for drinking money. Mara was hiding in a place that was already hiding from the world. Her survival depended on the same invisibility that protected the dwelling itself. She would not make fire. She would survive on stone heat, body heat, pinon nuts, dried mutton, seep water, and the stubborn conviction that warmth did not require flame if the walls were deep enough and the sun was aimed right. The 4th and 5th days became a rhythm of adaptation and measurement. Mara divided the dwelling into zones. The front room was the sunroom, warmest during the day, coldest at night because it was closest to the open air. She used it for drying wet clothing, cracking pinon, and collecting sunlight on the stone floor. The middle rooms were workrooms, cool but still, sheltered from wind, where she stacked stones, sorted materials, and repaired the brush windscreen. The back room was the sleeping room, the deepest, most insulated, where the stone bench held afternoon warmth into the early morning hours. She tracked the sun's path obsessively. In the morning, light entered the alcove at a low angle and reached the front room floor by the 2nd hour after dawn. By midday, the sun was high enough to strike the second room's wall through the aligned doorways. By late afternoon, the last angled light reached the stone bench in the back room, warming it for the night. The alcove's south-facing orientation and deep overhang worked together. Winter sun, low in the sky, penetrated deep into the rooms, while the overhang would block higher summer sun. The ancient builders had calibrated this. They had known. Mara improved her position in small, painful increments. She used the bone awl to punch holes in her shawl and lace it together with yucca fiber cord, turning it from a flat piece of fabric into a rough hood that covered her head and neck. She packed dry grass into the gaps in the brush windscreen, reducing the draft in the front room. She moved flat stones from the collapsed 6th room to the sleeping area, laying them in the sun during the day and dragging them into the back room at dusk, where they released stored heat slowly through the night. Each stone was perhaps 8 inches across and 4 inches thick. Each one gave perhaps an hour of perceptible warmth. She moved 4 stones every evening. Her body paid for every improvement. The cut on her foot from the pottery shard had closed, but ached when she climbed. Her palms, scabbed from the trail, cracked again every time she handled rough stone. Her knees were bruised from crawling through the fissure. Her stomach had moved past hunger into a flat, constant emptiness that she managed by eating pignon nuts at strict intervals. A small handful at dawn, another at midday, another at dusk. Bristle adapted faster than Mara. The dog found warmth sources she missed. A spot in the second room where reflected sunlight pooled on the floor. A crack in the back wall where air from deeper in the cliff was slightly warmer than the room air. He dug a nest in the dry grass and spent the coldest hours curled into a tight ball with his nose under his tail. When Mara shivered at night, Bristle pressed closer. His body heat was small but steady, and she understood for the first time why her father had told her that stonemasons' dogs slept against the south wall of the cutting shed. They knew which surfaces gave back warmth. On the fifth morning, Mara discovered something that changed her calculations. She was clearing sand from a sealed storage niche in the back room, one of several niches plugged with fitted stone and dried plaster. She had avoided them because Talwai's voice in her head told her not to open what was not hers, but the plaster on this niche had already cracked. Sand had pushed through the gap. The seal was failing on its own. She pulled the fitted stone free and looked inside. The niche held 2 clay jars, small, round, sealed with plugs of clay and wrapped in what might have been yucca fiber. Behind them, a basket tightly woven covered with a flat stone lid. Mara lifted one jar. It was lighter than she expected. She broke the clay seal with the awl and tilted the jar toward the light. Corn. Dried corn kernels, dark red and orange, packed tight. The jar held perhaps 3 cups. She opened the second jar. Beans. Small, hard, dark, rattling like pebbles. The basket held something else. Dried squash strips, brittle, thin, gray with age. The top layer crumbled when she touched it, but beneath the crumbled surface the strips were intact, hard as wood, preserved by the dry air of the alcove. Mara sat on the floor with the food in her lap and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since crawling out of the coal shed. Possibility. Then she saw the droppings. Mouse droppings in the basket, scattered through the squash strips, and on the rim of the second jar, a faint greenish dust that might have been mold. The food was old, decades old at minimum, centuries possibly. It had been sealed in a storage niche in a cliff dwelling abandoned before the town of Cortez existed. It might be safe. It might not. The corn in the sealed jar appeared clean. No droppings, no mold, no visible contamination. The beans looked similar. The squash was compromised. Mara chose carefully. She took only kernels from the intact jar, discarding any that were discolored or soft. She left the beans for now. She abandoned the squash entirely. She carried the good kernels to the front room in her tin cup and tried to eat one raw. It nearly broke her tooth. She needed to soften them. Without fire, that meant soaking. She placed a handful of kernels in the tin cup with seep water and set the cup on the warmest stone in the front room, a slab that received direct sun from mid-morning through early afternoon. By late afternoon, the kernels had softened slightly. She chewed them slowly, grinding each one between her molars until it broke into a gritty paste. It tasted like dust and starch and survival. She fed Bristle a small portion of softened kernels mixed with pignon. The dog ate everything and looked at her for more. She gave him 3 more kernels and stopped. The food cache changed the math. With pignon, dried mutton, soaked corn, and seep water, Mara could potentially survive for days. Maybe a week. Maybe more, if she rationed severely and if Talwai returned with another bundle. But the math also created a new burden. The food was not hers. The rooms were not hers. The ancient builders had stored corn for their children, not for a runaway orphan from St. Louis. Mara was eating borrowed breath, and she knew it, and the knowing sat in her chest beside the hunger like a second emptiness that food could not fill. She scraped the corn dust from the jar's rim, resealed it with a clay plug she shaped from damp alcove dust, and placed it back in the niche. She left the niche open so she could reach it, but she stacked a small cairn of stones in front of it. A marker, not a seal. A reminder that what she took, she owed. On the morning of the sixth day, the performance data arrived through Mara's body before her mind could name it. She woke and pressed her palm to the stone bench. Warm. Not faintly warm. Not the ghost of warmth she had felt the first morning. Warm the way a hearthstone is warm after a fire is burned down. Deep, radiating, real. The previous afternoon had been clear and windless, and the sun had poured into the alcove for 6 uninterrupted hours. The stone had drunk it all. She crawled to the front room. Frost coated the brush screen. The air beyond the entrance was sharp and still, and cold enough to make her eyes water. She could see ice on the exposed rock faces across the canyon, thick, white, opaque. The piñon trees on the trail wore glass sleeves on every branch. Inside the front room, the floor stone was cool, but not freezing. Mara checked her crude indicators, a smear of pork fat she had scraped from the mutton bundle and placed on 2 surfaces, one outside the entrance, one on the stone bench in the back room. Outside, the fat was white and hard as candle wax. On the bench, it was still soft enough to dent with her thumbnail. She checked the water. Her tin cup near the entrance held a solid plug of ice, frozen through. The cup she had left beside the seep in the back room had a thin skim on the surface, but when she pressed her finger through it, the water beneath was liquid. The dwelling was working. Not perfectly, not comfortably. Mara's toes ached in the mornings, and her fingers stayed stiff until the sun reached the front room, and the back room at dawn was cold enough that her breath fogged. But the stone walls were holding heat through the night, and the deep rooms were staying above freezing when the canyon outside was dropping well below it, and the wind that screamed across the cliff face touched nothing inside the alcove but dust and still air. She was measuring without knowing the numbers. If she had owned a thermometer, she would have found that the back room maintained temperatures roughly 20 to 25 degrees warmer than the outside air. Not because the stone generated heat, but because it stored the sun's energy during the day and released it slowly through the night while the overhanging walls blocked the convective heat loss that stripped conventional shelters bare. The principle was passive solar design. The execution was 600 years old. The physics had not changed. But the canyon had not shown its full hand. Marshal Vowell arrived at the base of the cliff on the 6th afternoon, not to climb, but to shout. Mara heard his voice rising from the wash, carried by the canyon walls. "Girl, if you are alive, come down. Quill has filed abandonment papers. If you do not return by week's end, you are no longer a ward. You are a vagrant. I can hold you as a vagrant." Mara did not answer. She pressed against the entrance screen and watched Vowell standing in the wash with his hat in his hands and his breath rising in white columns. He looked old from above. He looked tired. "I've seen a body pulled from this canyon in a January thaw," Vowell continued. "A freighter who thought he could cross the lower wash in a warm spell. The ice gave. He made it to a ledge. He had matches, a blanket, and a full canteen. He lasted 2 nights. Girl, he was a grown man who knew this country. You are a child with a dog." His voice echoed off the walls. Child with a dog, child with a dog, diminishing into the canyon's depth. Vowell stood there for another 10 minutes. Then he put his hat back on, mounted his horse, and rode east toward the wagon road. He did not look up at the cliff face. He did not know where she was. He was delivering a verdict to the rock itself, and the rock was not answering. The verdict was clear enough. Come down or become nothing. Not a ward, not a citizen, not a name in a ledger. A vagrant. A body waiting to be found. Mara sat in the front room and felt the sun on her legs and understood that Vowell was not cruel. He was honest. He believed what every experienced person in the valley believed, that no child could survive a November Canyon storm without fire, without food stores, without adult hands and adult knowledge. His dismissal was not malice. It was math. The math said she was dead. The stone under her palm said otherwise. But the stone had not yet been tested by the worst the canyon could deliver. That night, the wind shifted from west to north. The sound changed. The low moan she had heard on her first night deepened into something that vibrated in the walls. A sustained, pressurized hum that meant the air above the canyon rim was moving fast and the canyon itself was acting as a channel, funneling the wind into a concentrated current. Mara could feel it in the brush screen. The branches shuddered, and fine dust lifted from the front room floor and drifted toward the back. She moved her sleeping stones. She packed more grass around Bristle. She soaked corn kernels in the tin cup and set it on the bench to keep the water from freezing. Then she waited. The front arrived at the 11th hour of the night. Mara knew because she was awake, sitting in the back room with her arms around Bristle, when the sound outside changed from a hum to a roar. Freezing drizzle came first. She heard it on the rock outside the entrance, a hissing, crackling sound like fat in a pan. Then the hissing stopped and something heavier began. Pellets, hard and small, bouncing off the trail stones and rattling through the brush screen. Then snow, but not the soft, quiet snow she knew from St. Louis. This was wind-driven, horizontal, dense, moving so fast that it sounded like sand thrown against canvas. The temperature dropped in the front room within minutes. Mara could feel it advancing, cold air sliding across the floor like water, pushing toward the deeper rooms. She had sealed the side crack. She had packed the brush screen, but the alcove mouth was 22 feet wide, and no amount of brush could seal it against a wind that was pressing into the canyon like a fist into a glove. The front room surrendered first. The floor stone, which had been warm an hour ago, went cold. The fat smear hardened. Mara's breath fogged thick and heavy. The middle rooms held longer. The walls between rooms acted as baffles, slowing the cold air, breaking the current. Mara watched dust in the second room. It stirred, but slowly, rising and settling in the faint currents rather than streaming toward the back. The stored heat in the walls was fighting the incoming cold, and for now the walls were winning. The back room was the last stand. Mara pressed her palm to the stone bench and felt warmth, real, undeniable warmth, radiating from the mass of sandstone that had been absorbing the sun's energy for 6 consecutive days. The bench was a thermal battery. The walls were insulation. The 38 feet of room between the bench and the alcove mouth was a buffer zone that the cold was crossing one room at a time, losing energy with each barrier. Bristle stopped shivering. He pressed against the bench and closed his eyes. The first complication came at dawn. Bristle disappeared. Mara woke. She had slept without intending to, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of 6 days of hunger, cold, and fear. And Bristle was not beside her. She called his name. The sound echoed through the rooms, but nothing answered. She found him in the collapsed 6th room, behind a fallen slab that had shifted during the night. The wind had loosened something in the wall, or the temperature change had contracted the stone. Mara did not know which. A slab the size of a tabletop had tilted forward, trapping Bristle in a gap between the slab and the back wall. She could hear him barking, high and frantic, from behind the stone. The gap was too narrow for Mara's shoulders. She could see Bristle's eyes reflecting the faint light from the entrance. Wide, white-rimmed, terrified. He was unhurt, but pinned, unable to turn around in the space. Mara used the bone awl. She wedged it into the crack between the slab and the floor, levering against the stone the way her father had levered against quarry blocks, not with force, but with angle. She understood stone. She understood where it wanted to move and where it resisted. The slab was sandstone, heavy, perhaps 200 pounds, but it was balanced on an edge. If she could shift it 2 inches toward the wall, the gap would widen enough for Bristle to pull free. Her fingers were numb. The awl slipped twice. On the 3rd try, she drove it deep into the crack and pushed with her body weight. The slab ground against the floor and moved. 1 inch. Bristle scrambled. Mara pushed again, and the slab shifted enough for the dog to squeeze through. He came out shaking, licking her face, pressing against her legs. Mara held him and felt his heart racing against her palms. But the slab's movement had opened a crack in the back wall, a finger-wide gap that ran from floor to ceiling, where 2 courses of ancient masonry had shifted apart. Through the crack, Mara felt air moving, cold air. The wind outside was finding a new path into the dwelling. The back room, her last defense, was compromised. She worked fast. She had the flour sack she had stolen from outside the orphanage, thin, worn, barely a membrane. She had brush and dry grass. She had her wet shawl, soaked from the condensation that formed on the entrance stones each morning. She packed grass into the crack, then pressed the flour sack over it, then hung the wet shawl over the flour sack. The shawl, exposed to the cold air seeping through the crack, began to stiffen. Within an hour, it was frozen solid, a crude but effective ice dam that blocked the airflow. The repair was ugly. It would not last more than a day or two. But it held. The second complication came on the second night of the storm. The sealed food niche contained a second row of jars behind the first, hidden in the dark of the deeper shelf. Mara had not explored the full depth. Now, with hunger pressing harder, her pignon supply was low, the mutton was gone, the soaked corn was her primary food. She reached deeper and found 2 more jars in a smaller basket. One jar held beans. The other held corn. The basket held something different: dried meat, dark, hard, cut in strips and packed in dried sage leaves. The sage had preserved it better than the squash in the first basket. The meat strips were intact, brittle, but not crumbled, without visible mold. Mara ate a tiny piece. It tasted like nothing she recognized: gamey, dense, faintly sweet from the sage. Venison, maybe, or elk. The taste was ancient and strange, and her body accepted it before her mind decided whether it was safe. She boiled corn and beans together. The word boiled was generous. She soaked them in seep water in the tin cup placed on the warmest stone in the back room, which raised the water temperature enough to soften the kernels over the course of a full day. She mashed the softened mixture with the awl handle and shared it with Bristle. The dog ate slowly, which worried her, until she realized he was savoring it. The food was not treasure. It was borrowed breath. Mara repeated this to herself each time she opened the niche. She took the minimum. She resealed what she could. She marked what she had taken with charcoal scratches on the niche wall. 3 scratches for 3 cups of corn, 2 for beans, 1 for a strip of meat. A debt ledger, carved in the dark of a room that had been sealed for centuries. If you're invested in Mara and Bristle now, stay with us, because the next few minutes decide whether the cliff shelters her or gives her away. The third night was the worst. The wind accelerated. Snow drove into the canyon in horizontal sheets, filling the trail, piling against the brush screen, pressing into the fissure. The front room temperature dropped until Mara's tin cup, placed just inside the entrance, froze solid in less than an hour. The middle rooms followed, not freezing, but cold enough that Mara could see her breath in thick, white columns. The back room held. The stone bench, charged by 3 days of afternoon sun before the storm closed the sky, radiated heat into the air pocket where Mara and Bristle huddled. The frozen shawl over the crack stayed solid, blocking the wind leak. The grass and fiber bed beneath them trapped body heat. The walls, 5 feet of sandstone on 3 sides, more above, the mass of the cliff behind it, were a thermal reservoir so enormous that even 3 days of storm could not empty it. But the margin was thin. Mara could feel it in the air. The warmth was not growing, it was shrinking. Each hour the bench gave back a little less. Each hour the cold advanced a little further from the front room toward the back. The dwelling was winning, but it was winning the way a candle wins against a draft, by burning down. On the 4th morning, Mara made the decision she had been resisting. She needed fire. Not a bonfire, not a cooking fire. A thumbnail of flame, just enough to heat water and warm the air in the back room for a single hour. Talwai's warning, scratched on stone, said, "Do not make smoke." But Talwai's warning assumed Mara had another option. After 4 days of storm, with the bench cooling and the corn supply shrinking, and Bristle's breathing grown shallow and slow, Mara did not. She had no matches. She had no flint. But she had the broken pot. A thick-walled clay vessel, cracked but intact on one side, that she had found in the second room. She had juniper bark, dry and fibrous, and she had the bone awl and a flat piece of sandstone. Mara struck the awl against the sandstone. Sparks flew, small, brief, orange. The bone was not ideal. Steel would have been better, but the bone tip was hard enough, and the sandstone had enough quartz grain to produce sparks if she struck at the right angle. She struck for 20 minutes. Her hand cramped. The sparks landed on the juniper bark and died. She rearranged the bark into a tighter nest, added pinon pitch scraped from a cone, and struck again. A spark caught. The pitch glowed. Mara blew gently, steadily, the way she had seen her father blow on a forge coal. Not hard, not fast, just enough air to feed the heat without scattering it. The bark caught. A flame the size of her fingertip rose from the nest. She transferred it to the broken pot, added 2 more strips of bark, and let it burn. The fire lasted less than 15 minutes. The smoke, thin, gray, barely visible, rose to the alcove ceiling and spread along the soot-blackened stone. In a dwelling with a 22-foot wide opening, the smoke would have been invisible from below. But Mara was not thinking about below. She was holding the tin cup over the flame, heating water, watching the corn kernels soften in 30 minutes instead of 12 hours. She fed Bristle warm food for the first time in 6 days. The dog ate, and then pressed his nose against her hand and licked the salt from her skin. Mara smothered the fire with damp clay from the seep basin. The smoke ceased. The back room held the flame's brief warmth for an hour, maybe 2. It was not enough to matter in any measurable way, but it mattered in the way that mattered most. It proved that the dwelling could survive the storm, that the stone bench could be recharged by even a small heat source, and that Mara could manage fire inside the rooms without burning the structure or filling it with smoke. She did not light a second fire. 1 was enough. The storm would pass or it would not, and if it did not, a second fire would not save her. On the 4th afternoon, the wind dropped, not gradually, not in stages. The wind stopped as if a door had closed. One moment the canyon was howling, snow driving horizontal through the entrance screen, the brush shuddering. The next moment, silence. A silence so complete that Mara could hear her own pulse and Bristle's breathing and the faint drip of snowmelt from the alcove's lip. She crawled to the entrance and looked out. The canyon was white. Snow covered every surface below the cliff line. The trail, the wash, the talus slope, the pinon trees, the far canyon wall. Above the snow, the sky was breaking apart, gray clouds splitting to reveal a blue so deep it looked like water. The sun came through a gap in the clouds and hit the alcove mouth, and Mara felt the warmth on her face like a hand. She looked down at the valley. She could see the orphanage roof, or what was visible of it, a dark rectangle half buried in drifted snow. The chimney was not smoking. That was wrong. Even Quill's cracked stove should have been burning. The absence of smoke meant one of 2 things. Either the stove had failed completely, or there was no one left to feed it. Then she saw the smoke. Not from the chimney, from the ground. A low gray haze was seeping from the foundation of the main hall, rising through the snow in thin columns. The stovepipe had separated from the chimney. Smoke was filling the building instead of leaving it. Mara pressed her forehead against the cold stone of the entrance and saw, clearly and completely, what was happening below. 14 children in a building filling with smoke, with a stove they could not fix, in the aftermath of a storm that had dropped the temperature far below what the cracked firebox could handle. Quill's coal was spent. Quill's wood was wet. Quill's building was failing the way every building in the valley was failing, by losing heat to the wind faster than fire could replace it. The cliff had held. The valley had not. Mara had survived. The children she had left behind were in danger. The realization sat in her chest like the stone button from her father's coat. Small, heavy, impossible to ignore. She had climbed the cliff to save herself and Bristle. She had found a shelter that worked because ancient builders had understood something that every settler in the valley had forgotten. She was alive because stone remembered the sun, but being alive in a cliff while children suffocated in a smoke-filled orphanage was not survival. It was hiding. She looked at Bristle. The dog looked at her. His ears were forward. His tail moved once. Mara began to climb down. The descent nearly killed her faster than the storm had. Snow had buried the goat trail under a white shelf that looked solid and was not. Mara's first step past the fissure broke through the crust into loose powder beneath, and her boot slid on the iced rock underneath. She caught a juniper branch and held. Bristle stood above her on the trail, barking once, sharp. She moved on her hands and knees. The 3-foot gap in the trail was now invisible under a snow bridge that might hold her weight or might not. She lay flat and tested it with her palm, pressing slowly, feeling for the rock beneath. The snow compressed but held. She crawled across on her stomach, distributing her weight across as much surface as possible, and made it to the other side with her heart slamming against the stone. The lower trail was worse, steeper, more exposed, with ice beneath the snow where freezing drizzle had coated the rock before the snowfall buried it. Mara fell twice. The second fall opened the cut on her foot again, and she left red prints in the snow for the last 100 yards. She reached the wash at mid-morning. The orphanage was half a mile east. Smoke was still seeping from the foundation in gray columns that flattened against the snow and spread. No one was outside. No footprints in the yard except the ones leading to and from the woodpile, already filling with drift. Mara walked through the front door without knocking. The main hall was hazy with smoke, not the thick, choking smoke of an open fire, but a thin, persistent fog that hung at chest height and smelled of coal dust and creosote. The stovepipe had separated from the chimney sleeve. Mara could see the gap, a 2-inch ring of daylight where the joint had pulled apart during the storm's shaking. Smoke that should have gone up was pouring into the room. 14 children were against the far wall. The younger ones had rags pressed over their mouths. A girl Mara recognized, Ludi, 8 years old, small, with a persistent cough that had worsened through the autumn, lay on a pallet with her lips blue-tinged and her breathing shallow and fast. Ada knelt beside Ludi with a wet cloth on her forehead. Quill stood near the stove with his arms crossed. He was not helping. He was watching the smoke with the expression of a man calculating losses. Not human losses, but operational ones. How long until the county inspector arrived? How to explain the broken pipe? How to frame the story so that the fault lay with the children, the weather, the building, anyone but himself? Marshal Vowell sat on the bench near the door, his coat covered in snow. He had arrived that morning and found the building in crisis. He was furious, but his fury had no handle to grip. The building was county property. Quill was the appointed superintendent. Vowell could inspect but not command. He could recommend but not remove. Then Mara walked in. The room went silent. Ada looked up from Ludi's pallet, and her mouth opened but no sound came out. The younger children stared. Quill's arms dropped to his sides. Vowell stood up from the bench. Mara was thin, filthy, and bleeding from her right foot. Her dress was torn at the shoulder where the coal shed sill had scraped her 6 days earlier. Her shawl was gone, frozen to the back wall of the cliff dwelling, serving as a wind baffle. Her hair was matted with dust and pinon pitch. She carried Bristle under one arm and a small cloth bundle under the other. She was alive. She was dry. Under the outer layer of frost and trail grime, her clothing was not soaked through. Her skin, though dirty, was not the gray-white of frostbite. Her fingers moved freely. Her eyes were clear. Vowell noticed first. He stepped forward and touched Mara's sleeve, the inner layer, near the wrist. His face changed. He said, "You're dry." "Yes." "Where were you?" "Where the wind couldn't spend me." Quill found his voice. "She was hiding in a hole in the cliff like a rat. She stole food from this institution and ran. She's a thief and a vagrant, and I will have her placed with the Garrett Ranch before the week is out." Vowell did not look at Quill. He was still holding Mara's sleeve, his thumb pressing the fabric, testing the dryness, the way a man tests the grain of wood before cutting. He said, "Girl, my stovepipe is separated, my building is full of smoke, and I have a child with blue lips. Tell me where you were and how you were dry, and tell me now." Mara set Bristle down. The dog shook, scattering ice crystals across the floor, and walked to Ludi's pallet and lay down beside her. Ludi's hand, small and gray, found Bristle's ear and held it. Mara said, "The cliff dwelling faces south. The overhang blocks wind. The stone walls hold the sun's heat through the night. The deeper the room, the warmer it stays. Water at the back wall did not freeze when water at the front froze solid in an hour. I had no fire for 5 days. The stone was enough." Vowel looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "That is not possible." "Your stovepipe is separated," Mara said. "Your building is losing heat through every crack and through the hole where the pipe should be. You have been burning coal and wood for months, and the room is still cold because the wind takes the heat faster than the fire makes it. The cliff does not have that problem. The cliff does not let the wind in." Vowel released her sleeve. He said slowly, "The cliff dwelling, the old rooms up the south wall. 5 rooms, maybe more, a seep for water, storage niches. The back room stayed above freezing through the whole storm. Nobody has been in those rooms in hundreds of years. Yes, the rooms still work." Quill stepped forward. "This is nonsense. She is raving from cold and hunger. She hid in a hole, and she is lucky to be alive, and she will be punished for running and for theft and for—" "Vernon," Vowel said without turning around. "Be quiet." The room went still. Vowel had not raised his voice. He had not moved, but the word carried the weight of a man who had freighted supplies through Ute territory and buried 3 mule skinners in a single winter and had never once told a man to be quiet unless he meant it absolutely. Quill was quiet. Vowel looked at Mara. He looked at Ludi on the pallet. He looked at the smoke still seeping from the stovepipe gap. He said, "Show me." Mara did not take Vowel to the cliff dwelling. Not yet. Instead, she showed him what she could demonstrate in the orphanage yard. She walked outside and pressed her palm against the north wall of the main hall. Cold. The stone was as cold as the air, maybe colder because the wind had been driving against it for 4 days, and the wall had no stored heat to give back. She moved to the south wall. The morning sun was hitting it directly. The stone was warmer, not warm, but distinctly less cold. She made Vowel press his palm to both walls. "Feel the difference," she said. Vowel felt it. His expression did not change, but his hand stayed on the south wall for a long time. Mara walked to the woodpile and picked up a flat river stone that sat on top, exposed to the sun. She carried it inside and placed it on the floor near Ludi's pallet. Then she went back and brought 3 more. The stones were warm from the morning sun. Not hot, not dramatic, but holding heat in their mass the way a brick holds heat after a kiln cools. "These will cool in an hour," she said. "But if you put more stones in the sun every morning and bring them inside every afternoon, the room stays warmer through the night without burning anything. The cliff does this with a whole wall." Vowel said, "Stones. Stone holds heat. The bigger the stone, the longer it holds. A wall of stone that faces south and sits behind a windbreak will hold heat all night. The old builders knew this. They chose south-facing alcoves because the winter sun is low and reaches the back wall. In summer, the sun is high and the overhang blocks it. They did not need the rooms to be cool in summer. They needed them to be warm in winter." Vowel was a practical man. He did not believe in magic, and he did not trust children, and he had spent 30 years on the frontier learning that most ideas that sounded clever were fatal when tested. But he was also a man who could feel the difference between a south wall and a north wall under his palm, and he could see that Mara Bellamy had survived 6 days in a canyon storm without fire and returned dry-clothed and clear-eyed while his orphanage was filling with smoke. He said, "I will go to the cliff, not today, tomorrow, when the trail has cleared enough to walk." "Not alone," Mara said. "Talwai Yazi should go with you. The rooms belong to living peoples. You cannot treat them as a curiosity." Quill said from across the room, "The Indian woman." "Of course. The Indian woman and the runaway girl and the haunted cliff. This is how county funds get wasted, on superstition and disobedience. Vowel turned to Quill. He said, "Show me your ledger." The color left Quill's face. Not slowly. All at once, like water dropped from a cup. He said, "The ledger is administrative. It is not subject to inspection without county board authority." "I have inspection authority over any county-supported institution in this district," Vowel said. "Show me your ledger, or I will send to Cortez for the board auditor, and he will show it to me." Quill did not produce the ledger. He said something about proper channels and administrative procedure and the rights of appointed superintendents. Vowel listened without expression. Then he walked to Quill's office, opened the desk, and took the ledger himself. What he found in the next hour would not fully resolve until weeks later, but the first page he opened told him enough. Quill had been claiming county payments for 3 children who had already been placed out, sent to ranch families months ago, but still listed as residents. The coal allotment for 14 children had been drawn for 17. The difference had gone into Quill's pocket, or into the lamp oil and whiskey he purchased in Cortez, or into both. Vowel closed the ledger. He looked at Quill. He said, "These children are moving to the church hall tonight. You're going to Cortez with me tomorrow to explain this to the board. If you touch one child between now and morning, I will not wait for the board." Quill left the room without speaking. He walked to the stable, saddled his horse, and rode toward Cortez alone. He did not say goodbye to the children. He did not take the ledger. Ada watched him go from the window and said quietly to Mara, "He will tell the board you destroyed his building and drove him out." Mara said, "He can tell them whatever he wants. Ludi needs warm water and dry air. Can you help me move her?" The church hall was not much better than the orphanage, but it was different in ways that mattered. The building was newer, tighter joints, a functioning stove with a sound chimney, and it had south-facing windows that Mara insisted be cleared of frost and left uncovered during the day. The minister, a thin, cautious man named Partridge, who feared Quill's influence but feared dead children more, gave Mara the run of the cellar. Mara transformed the cellar in 2 days. She directed Ada and 2 older boys to carry flat river stones from the wash and lay them in the south-facing window wells, where the sun struck them directly for 3 hours each afternoon. At dusk, they moved the stones to the sleeping area. She packed mud and rags into the north wall cracks. She raised the sleeping pallets off the stone floor with scrap lumber, creating an air gap that reduced heat loss to the ground. She stored water inside in covered buckets so it would not freeze, and she built a small shelf from an old crate, hung from a rafter beam by rope, to keep food above floor level and away from rodents and damp. She established rules that she did not explain as rules but demonstrated as practice. Close the cellar door behind you. Do not open the south windows until the sun has been on them for an hour. Keep the sleeping area in the deepest corner, farthest from the door. Do not waste heat by moving between rooms unnecessarily. The children watched her work with the mixture of skepticism and hope that orphans reserved for any adult or near adult who appeared to care. They had been failed so many times that competence looked like a trick. Mara did not reassure them with words. She showed them. She showed Ludi how to press her palm to the river stones and feel the difference between a sun-warmed stone and a cold one. Ludi, whose cough was easing in the dry air of the cellar, touched the stone and looked at Mara with the first expression Mara had seen on her face that was not fear or pain. It was interest. She showed Ada how to test wind direction with ash, throw a pinch low, near the floor, and watch where it drifts. If it drifts toward the wall, the seal is holding. If it drifts toward the center of the room, there is a leak drawing cold air inward. Ada said, "The Indian woman taught you this. Her name is Talwai. And yes, she taught you the cliff trick too? She taught me to listen to stone. The cliff taught me the rest." Ada considered this. She said, "I spent 6 nights in a building full of smoke because I was too afraid to follow you. Ludi almost died. The younger ones cried every night, and Quill sat in his office with the door shut and the good lamp burning while we choked." Mara did not answer right away. She was packing mud into a crack between the cellar wall stones, pressing it in with her thumbs, smoothing it flat. She said, You told me where the goat trail started. You held Quill off for a night. You did not do nothing, Ada. I did not do enough. Neither did I. I left you all behind. They worked in silence after that. The crack sealed. The draft stopped. The cellar temperature rose by a degree that neither of them could measure, but both of them could feel. Talwai Yazi returned to the canyon 3 days after the storm broke. She came on foot with 4 goats and a bundle of wool. She did not come to the church hall. She came to the wash below the cliff and waited. Vowel found her there because Mara had told him where to look. The meeting was uncomfortable. Vowel was a man who had served in the army during the years when the Diné were still being pushed from their lands, and he carried the awkwardness of that history in his posture. Talwai was a woman who remembered the long walk through the stories of her mother and aunts, and she carried that memory in her silence. They were not enemies. They were people who stood on different sides of a wound that had not healed and would not heal by being ignored. Mara stood between them, not as translator because both spoke English, but as the reason they were standing in the same place. She said, I want to show him the rooms. I need your permission. Not because the rooms are mine to show, because you told me to respect them, and I will not go against that. Talwai looked at Vowel. She said, You want to see how the girl survived? Vowel said, I want to understand why a child with no fire lived through a storm that killed a man's cattle on the valley floor. The old people understood the sun, Talwai said. They built where the sun reached and the wind did not. This is not a secret. This is sense that was abandoned. I want to see it. You will see it. You will not take from it. You will not tell others where the entrance is. You will not bring tools or crates or men with hammers. Vowel agreed. The 3 of them climbed the goat trail, slowly, because the snow had compacted on the path and the ice was still treacherous. Talwai moved ahead with her goats, finding footholds Mara had missed, taking a route that avoided the worst of the exposure. At the collapsed section, Talwai crossed on a natural ledge 6 feet below the trail that Mara had never seen. The gap that had nearly stopped Mara and had stopped Quill's hired man was irrelevant. The canyon had more than one path for those who knew where to look. At the fissure, Talwai stopped. She looked at the disturbed brush, the cleared entrance, the marks of Mara's passage. Her expression tightened but did not close. She said, You moved stones inside. I stacked fallen ones across a side crack to block wind. Show me. Mara led them in. Vowel had to turn sideways through the fissure. He was broader than Mara and grunted as the rock pressed against his chest. Inside, he stood in the front room and said nothing for a long time. The dwelling was as Mara had left it. The front room swept, the charcoal sun marks on the floor, the sealed side crack, the stone bench in the back room still faintly warm from the previous afternoon. Vowel pressed his palm to the bench. He pressed it to the back wall. He walked to the entrance and pressed it to the exposed stone outside. He came back in and did it again. The difference is real, he said. Yes. How much warmer? I don't have a thermometer, but outside my tin cup freezes solid in an hour. In the back room, the seep water stays liquid. The difference is enough. Vowel looked at the mealing stones, the storage niches, the soot-blackened ceiling. He looked at Mara's charcoal marks on the floor, the sun path tracking she had done during her 6 days of occupation. He said, You map the sun. The light moves through the rooms during the day. First the floor, then the walls, then the bench. By late afternoon, the bench is warm. It stays warm through most of the night. Without fire. I made fire once, a small one, in a broken pot for 15 minutes. The rest was stone. Talwai had been moving through the rooms in silence, examining what Mara had touched and what she had left alone. She found the storage niche with the charcoal tally marks. She stood in front of it for a long time. Then she said, You ate from the stores. Mara's stomach tightened. I was starving. I took the minimum I could. I marked what I took. I see that? Talwai touched the charcoal marks. 3 cups corn, 2 cups beans, 1 strip meat. I will replace it. I don't know how, but I will. Talwai said, You cannot replace 600-year-old corn, girl. Her voice was not angry, it was precise. What you took is gone. What you owe is not a debt in kind. It is a debt in understanding. You used what the old people stored. Now you carry what the old people knew. That is the payment. They spent the afternoon repairing Mara's damage. Talwai directed Vowel in restacking the stones Mara had moved across the side crack, not removing the repair, but adjusting it so the stonework matched the original courses more closely. They covered the broken jar from the first basket with a fitted stone. They swept sand back into the collapsed sixth room where Mara's passage had disturbed the floor. Talwai marked a boundary across the entrance to the storage area with a line of charcoal and small stones. The line said, "This far and no further." Before they left, Talwai made Mara repeat, "Need is not ownership." Mara repeated it. She meant it. But she also understood something Talwai did not say aloud. That need had given her knowledge. And knowledge was a different kind of possession, one that could be carried without taking, shared without depleting, and applied in places that did not require entering the old rooms again. The cliff dwelling had taught her the principle. She did not need to live there to use it. The weeks that followed were not the relief the children had hoped for. Quill reached Cortez ahead of Vowel and spent 2 days constructing a version of events in which Mara had destroyed county property, incited rebellion among the orphans, and consorted with a vagrant Indian woman to loot archaeological sites for profit. The county board, composed of 3 ranchers and a mining claim lawyer, received Quill's account with the seriousness that men give to other men who speak in confident paragraphs. Vowel arrived with the ledger. The ledger spoke louder than Quill. The discrepancies were clear. 3 children listed as residents who had been placed out months earlier, coal allotments drawn for 17 when 14 was the true count, a pattern of expenditures that matched no visible improvement in the building or its occupants. The board did not remove Quill immediately. County politics moved with the speed of winter sap, but they suspended his authority pending a full audit and appointed Vowel as temporary overseer. Quill returned to McElmo Canyon in a wagon with his personal trunk and a silence that felt more dangerous than his shouting. He took a room at Orrin Vale's boarding house and spent his evenings at the store, drinking coffee and talking to anyone who would listen about the girl who had ruined a functioning institution because she could not follow rules. Some people believed him. Orrin Vale believed him, or pretended to, because Quill owed him money, and a discredited Quill was a Quill who could not pay. 2 ranch wives believed him because they had placed children at the home and needed to believe the home had been well run. A freighter named Coot believed him because Coot believed anything that made a woman look foolish. But the weather was on Mara's side. The storm that had separated the orphanage stovepipe had also killed cattle on 3 ranches, collapsed a hay barn near the trading post, and frozen the pump at the general store solid. The valley was hurting. People who had lost livestock and grain to the cold were not interested in Quill's administrative grievances. They were interested in staying warm, and word was spreading slowly through Ada and the older children, through Vowel's quiet mentions at the store, through Talwai's trading contacts, that the Bellamy girl had survived 6 days in a cliff without fire by using stone heat and wind protection and the south-facing principles that the old builders had understood before any settler arrived. People came to the church hall. Not in groups, one at a time. A rancher's wife whose north-facing cabin lost heat so fast she burned a cord of wood a week. A widower with 3 children in a soddy that leaked wind through every seam. A sheepherder whose winter camp was sheltered from snow, but not from the ground cold that rose through his bedroll at night. Mara showed them the cellar. She showed them the river stones in the window wells. She showed them the mud-packed cracks, the raised pallets, the south-facing orientation that made the difference between survivable cold and killing cold. She explained in the plain, specific language that Talwai had used with her. The sun warms stone. Stone holds heat. Wind takes heat. Stop the wind first, then let the stone do its work. She did not lecture. She pressed their palms to the south wall and the north wall and let their hands tell them what her words could not. If this story reminds you why preparation matters before the crisis arrives, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Talwai returned twice more before the winter deepened. The first visit was practical. She brought Mara a pair of wool-lined moccasins that fit better than the orphanage boots and would not slide on iced rock. She brought piñon nuts in a deerskin pouch and 2 strips of dried mutton wrapped in sage. She brought information. Quill had been asking at the trading post near Tawak whether anyone knew the location of the cliff dwelling. No one had told him, but the questions themselves were dangerous. Mara said, "He wants to loot it." Talwai said, "He wants to prove you stole from it. If he can show the board that you took artifacts, he can reframe his case. You become the thief. He becomes the man who tried to stop you." "I took food. I left everything else." "He does not need the truth. He needs the story." The second visit was different. Talwai arrived at the church hall on a morning when the valley was locked in a hard frost, the kind that turned standing water to stone and made fence wire sing. She found Mara in the cellar, teaching Ludi how to feel the difference between a sun-warmed stone and a shadow-cooled one. Ludi's cough had subsided. Her lips were no longer blue. She held her palm to the stone and said, "This one is warm." Talwai watched from the doorway. After Ludi returned to the other children, Talwai sat on the cellar steps and said, "You teach well. I teach what you taught me. I taught you how to read stone and wind. You are teaching them how to use it. Those are different skills." They talked for an hour. Not about survival. About the canyon, the old rooms, the people who built them. Talwai told Mara things she had not told her before. Not sacred things. Not ceremonial knowledge, but practical history. The ancestral Pueblo people had grown corn on the mesa top and stored food in the cliff rooms where the temperature was stable and rodents were easier to control. They had built in south-facing alcoves because the winter sun's low angle penetrated deep under the overhang, while the summer sun, high overhead, was blocked. They had used small rooms with thick walls because small volumes lose heat more slowly than large ones. The whole dwelling was a tool, Talwai said. Not just shelter, a tool for living through seasons. Why did they leave? Talwai was quiet for a while. Drought, war, change. People leave places for many reasons. The rooms stayed because stone does not leave. They disagreed once, sharply. Mara suggested that Vowel should bring a few trusted men to the cliff to study the construction techniques, the wall thickness, the orientation, the room arrangement, and apply them to settler buildings. Talwai said no. "The rooms are not a school," she said. "They are not a demonstration. They are a place that belongs to living people, and those people have not been asked. The principles can be used without entering the rooms. Then use the principles without entering the rooms." Mara pushed back. People will die in buildings that lose heat because no one taught them what the old builders knew. If the knowledge stays locked in the cliff, the knowledge is not locked in the cliff. It is in your hands. You felt it. You understood it. You are already teaching it. The cliff does not need to be opened for the knowledge to move. Talwai stood. She looked old in the cellar light, older than 64. Worn by years of walking canyon trails and herding goats through weather that killed younger people. She said, "You are not keeper of the old rooms. You are keeper of what you learned there. That is different, and the difference is everything." She left a small woven cord on the step where she had been sitting. It was braided from goat wool, tight, no longer than Mara's forearm, a gift or a symbol. Mara did not ask which because she understood that asking would have been the wrong response. She tied the cord around her wrist and wore it. Talwai did not come again. Word reached the valley in late February that the old woman had fallen ill after a trip to warn a sheep camp about a coming ice storm. She had walked 12 miles in a single day through frozen ground and arrived at the camp with a cough that turned to fever. Her relatives came from near Shiprock and took her home. Whether she recovered or did not, Mara did not learn that winter. The canyon kept its silences. Mara sat in the cellar the evening she heard the news, with Bristle beside her and Ludi asleep on a pallet across the room and the woven cord tight around her wrist. The river stones in the window well were cooling. The south wall still held heat. Outside, the February dark pressed against the glass with the patience of a season that was not finished yet. She did not cry. She had not cried since the coal shed, but she pressed her palm to the cellar wall and held it there for a long time, feeling the stone's warmth diminish degree by degree into the night, and she understood that warmth was always leaving, always being spent, and the only answer was to keep collecting it. From sun, from stone, from the people who taught you where to put your hands. March came in wet and wrong. The winter had been brutal, record cold, heavy snow, livestock losses across the valley. But March, instead of softening, delivered a thaw that turned to rain over frozen ground. The soil, locked in frost for 3 months, could not absorb the water. It sheeted across the surface, filling washes, cutting gullies, turning the wagon road into a channel of brown water and loose stone. On the 14th of March, a supply wagon carrying 2 children from a placement that had failed, a brother and sister, 9 and 11, returned by a ranch family that could no longer feed them, overturned near the wash a mile from the church hall. The wagon hit a submerged rut, the front axle snapped, and the bed tilted and dropped into the flooded wash with both children inside. The driver, a young hired man, pulled the girl out immediately. The boy was pinned under the collapsed bed frame, his leg trapped between the side rail and a sack of flour that had shifted during the fall. The water was rising. The driver could not lift the frame alone. Mara was at the church hall when she heard the shouting. She ran. She found the wagon on its side in the wash, water churning around it, the boy's face barely above the surface. The driver was chest deep, holding the boy's head up with one hand and pulling at the frame with the other. The girl stood on the bank, screaming. Mara did not think about Talawai's teachings in that moment. She did not consciously apply principles. She acted from the body knowledge that 6 days in a cliff dwelling and 3 months of cellar work had built into her muscles and her judgment. She sent the girl to the church hall for rope. She waded into the wash. The water was cold enough to stop her breath, cold enough to make her legs seize, osaxe, and reached the wagon frame. She did not try to lift it. She assessed. The frame was heavy, water-soaked, tangled with harness leather, but it was resting on an angle balanced between the wash bottom and the flour sack. If she could shift the flour sack, the frame would tilt and the boy's leg would come free. She used a broken spoke from the wheel as a lever. She drove it under the flour sack and pushed. The sack shifted 2 inches. The boy screamed. Mara pushed again. The sack moved, the frame tilted, and the driver pulled the boy free. They carried him to the bank. His leg was bruised and swelling, but not broken. The girl arrived with Ada and rope. They hauled the flour sack out of the wash and carried both children to the church hall. Mara was wet through and shaking. The March water was colder than the November storm had been, moving water-stripped heat faster than still air, and her clothing had no insulation when soaked. She knew from the cliff what she needed: dry clothes, a wind-free space, stone warmth. She changed in the cellar, pressed against the south wall until her shivering stopped, and drank warm water that Ada had heated on the stove. The boy's leg healed in 2 weeks. The girl stayed at the church hall and became one of Mara's most attentive students, pressing her palm to every stone surface she passed. But the wagon carried a second passenger that Mara did not learn about until evening. Vernon Quill had been riding behind the wagon, heading back toward McElmo Canyon from Cortez with a trunk of personal papers. When the wagon overturned, Quill's horse spooked and threw him into the wash downstream. He struck his head on a rock, lost consciousness, and was carried 50 yards by the current before catching on a snag of juniper roots. Vowell's men found him in the late afternoon, soaked, hypothermic, lying in the shallows with his trunk floating beside him. They carried him to the church hall because it was the nearest shelter with a functioning stove. Mara was there when they brought him in. Quill was gray-faced, barely conscious, his lips the same blue that Ludi's had been in November. His clothing was soaked through. His skin was cold to the touch. She did not hesitate. She directed the men to strip his wet clothes and wrap him in dry blankets. She placed heated river stones at his feet and along his sides. She raised his head and gave him warm water in small sips. She did everything she had learned: wind protection, Dry insulation, stone heat, patience, for the man who had locked her in a coal shed and ordered her dog killed. Ada stood in the doorway and watched. She said, "You could let him be cold for a while." Mara said, "I could, but then I would be him." Quill survived. He woke the next morning in the church cellar, wrapped in blankets with warm stones against his body, and Bristle lying across his feet because the dog had no sense of politics and only understood that a cold body needed warmth. Quill looked at Mara. He looked at the stones. He looked at the dog on his feet. He did not say thank you. He said, "You did this. The stones did this. I moved them. You could have left me in the wash. I could have." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The Garrett Ranch, the one I was going to send you to. Garrett works his placement girls until they cannot stand. I knew that. I was going to send you anyway." Mara said nothing. "I'm telling you this so you understand what you saved." "I did not save you. I stopped you from freezing. Those are not the same thing." Quill closed his eyes. Bristle shifted on his feet. The river stones cooled slowly against his sides, giving back the sun they had collected through the cellar window that morning, and the man who had tried to destroy the girl who carried them lay in the warmth she had learned from a cliff and felt, perhaps for the first time, the specific weight of an obligation he could not log in a ledger. Quill's confession in the cellar did not redeem him. It did not make him kind or sorry in any way that changed his actions, or willing to stand before the county board and say what he had said to Mara with warm stones against his ribs and a dog on his feet. What it did was crack the wall he had built between his actions and their consequences, and once that crack opened, the weather got in. He stayed at the boarding house through the rest of March. He ate alone. He spoke to Orrin Vale about supply orders and nothing else. He did not visit the church hall. He did not ask about the children. When the county auditors arrived in early April, two men from Durango with ledger books of their own and a habit of asking the same question 3 different ways, Quill answered their questions with the flat, careful precision of a man who had rehearsed his lies and discovered somewhere between the wash and the cellar that the rehearsal no longer held. The auditors found everything Vowell's initial inspection had suggested and more. 3 phantom children on the rolls, drawing county funds for months after placement. Coal and food allotments inflated by 20%. A payment to a Cortez carpenter for stove repairs that had never been performed. The stove that had nearly killed the children with smoke was the same stove that Quill had claimed was fixed in September. Donated blankets logged as received but never distributed. Quill had sold them to a freighter heading south. Ada testified. She described the coal shed, the smoke, the blue-lipped children, the strap Quill used on girls who spoke without permission. She described the night Mara escaped and the 6 days that followed. The stove failure, the smoke filling the building, the younger children pressing rags to their faces while Quill sat in his office with the door closed. Vowell testified. He described the stovepipe separation, the smoke, the conditions he found on the morning after the storm. He described Mara's return, dry, clear-eyed, alive, and his inspection of the cliff dwelling. He described the ledger discrepancies. Mara was called to testify last. She sat on a chair in the church hall with the 2 auditors across from her and Vowell standing near the door and Quill seated in the back row with his hands in his lap. The auditors asked about the coal shed, the escape, the cliff, the food she had taken from the storage niche. They were thorough. They were not unkind. Mara answered every question plainly until the auditors asked about Bristle. Then she stopped being plain. She said, "He ordered the dog killed because anything loved without permission was theft to him. That is how he saw the children. Not as people, as property that cost him coal and food and trouble. The dog was the only thing in that building that gave warmth without being fed from his ledger, and he could not tolerate it." Quill did not look up. The auditors completed their report in a week. Quill was removed from his position, barred from any county appointment, and referred to the district court in Durango for charges related to misappropriation of public funds. The charges were not dramatic. No one went to prison for stealing coal from orphans in 1887, not when the coal amounted to less than $40 over 9 months. But the removal was permanent, and the record followed Quill to every boarding house and saloon and freight office where he tried to rebuild himself into a man who had not been broken by a 15-year-old girl and a terrier. His final appearance in Mara's life came on the day he left Macalmo Canyon for good. She was outside the church hall, laying river stones in the south-facing window wells for the afternoon collection, when Quill's wagon passed on the road. He stopped. He did not get down from the seat. He looked at the stones in the window wells. He looked at the children inside the hall, visible through the cleared glass, sitting on raised pallets with dry blankets and a stove that drew clean. He said, "You made them believe a wall could care for them." Mara straightened. She held a river stone in both hands, flat, gray, warm from the morning sun. She said, "No, I made them stop trusting men who didn't." Quill held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he flicked the reins, and the wagon moved, and he was gone down the road toward Cortez, and whatever reduced life waited for him beyond the valley. Mara placed the stone in the window well and went back to work. The summer of 1888 brought 2 things to Macalmo Canyon that changed the shape of Mara's life: the public discovery of the large cliff dwellings on Mesa Verde, and a boy named Jonah Rusk. The cliff dwellings had always been known to the Ute people and to Diné and Hispano traders and herders who moved through the canyons. But in December of 1888, 2 ranchers searching for stray cattle stumbled across the largest dwelling and brought word back to the settlements. Within months, the ruins became a destination. Curiosity seekers, artifact collectors, newspaper correspondents, and eventually the first voices arguing for preservation. Mara watched the discovery unfold with a tight feeling in her chest. The dwelling she had sheltered in was smaller, hidden, unknown to the public rush. But every newspaper account of pottery pulled from alcoves and stones pried from walls felt like a hand reaching toward the fissure where she had crawled on her belly with a dog under her coat. She said nothing publicly. She told no one the location. When asked whether she had seen the cliff ruins, she said she had seen alcoves in the canyon and changed the subject. Talwai's voice in her memory said, "Need is not ownership." The canyon's hidden places were not Mara's to reveal, and the growing appetite for artifacts and spectacle confirmed every warning Talwai had given about what happened when the wrong kind of attention found the old rooms. Jonah Rusk arrived in June. He was 17, lanky, with ink-stained fingers, and a habit of tilting his head when he listened that made him look like a bird considering a problem. His mother, Nell Rusk, had come from Mancos to help audit the orphanage's remaining accounts and establish a proper record system for the children now housed at the church hall. Jonah had come because his mother told him to carry the ledger books and because he had nothing better to do in the summer between his apprenticeship terms at the Mancos print shop. He met Mara on his second day in the valley. She was in the church cellar, showing a ranch wife named Hetty Groves how to arrange sleeping pallets away from north walls, and how to use flat stones as heat reservoirs. Jonah had been sent to the cellar to count blankets for the audit. He stood in the doorway with a pencil behind his ear and a counting board in his hand, and watched Mara press the ranch wife's palm to the south wall. "Feel that," Mara said. "Now feel the north wall. The difference is there every day. You do not need a thermometer. Your hand is the thermometer." Hetty felt it. Her face changed. She said, "My cabin faces north. The whole front wall faces north. Then your cabin is giving heat to the wind all winter. You cannot move the cabin, but you can seal the north wall with mud and rags, and you can open the south side to let the sun in, and you can put stones where the sun hits and move them to the sleeping area at night. Stones. Stones hold heat. The bigger and darker the stone, the more it holds. Flat river stones work best because you can lay them under blankets." Jonah wrote this down. He had not been asked to write it down. He was supposed to be counting blankets. But he was a printer's apprentice, and printers wrote things down the way stonemasons tested rock, automatically, without decision, because the hand knew its work. Mara noticed him writing and said, "Who are you?" "Jonah Rusk. I'm counting blankets." "You are not counting blankets. You are writing what I said." "Both." He showed her the counting board. On one side, blanket tallies. On the other, in small, precise handwriting, south wall, stone heat, flat river stones, seal, north wall. Mara looked at his notes and then at his face. She said, "Can you print that?" "I can print anything. I have a press in Manco's." "Not a book, a notice, something people can put on a wall. The rules for keeping a house warm without burning everything you own." Jonah considered this with his head tilted. He said, "How many rules?" Mara counted on her fingers. "South wall, dry bedding, stored water, wind stopped first, stone holds heat, small rooms lose less, never open a door without closing another." 7 rules. I can set that in an afternoon." He did. 3 days later, he brought a stack of printed handbills to the church hall. The paper was rough, the ink slightly uneven. The Manco's press was not a fine instrument, but the words were clear. Winter preparedness for the home. South wall receives sun. Face your living space south. Dry bedding saves heat. Wet blankets steal it. Stored water inside will not freeze if the room is sealed. Stop the wind first. Seal every north crack with mud, rags, or clay. Stone holds heat. Place dark flat stones in the sun by day. Move them to the sleeping area at dusk. Small rooms lose less warmth than large ones. Sleep in the smallest room you can seal. Never open a door without closing another. Every open door is a channel for wind. Vowell took 20 copies and distributed them along the wagon road. Hetty Groves took 3 for her neighbors. The minister took 5 for the congregation. Ada took 1 and pinned it to the cellar wall beside the sleeping pallets. Mara looked at the handbill and felt something she had not expected. The knowledge was no longer hers alone. It was on paper. It could travel. It could reach people she would never meet, in cabins she would never enter, through winters she would never survive for them. The cliff dwelling had given her the principle. Talwai had given her the language. Jonah had given it legs. She said to Jonah, "Thank you." He said, "You did the hard part. I pushed ink." Ink travels further than hands. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and she noticed that his eyes narrowed when he did, which made the smile look earned rather than automatic. She also noticed that she had noticed, which was a different kind of warmth than stone held, faster, less reliable, harder to measure. She did not pursue the feeling. She had 14 children, a cellar, a valley of skeptics converting one by one, and a hidden cliff dwelling that she guarded with silence. Romance was a luxury for people who had time to sit still, and Mara had not sat still since November. But Jonah did not leave. His mother finished the audit, but Jonah volunteered to help Vowell establish the new children's home, a proper institution with transparent records, no unpaid labor contracts, and a board of oversight that included the minister, Vowell, Nell Rusk, and at Vowell's insistence, Mara Bellamy. Jonah stayed because there was printing to do, and because the valley needed a press, and because, though he did not say this aloud for another year, the girl who taught stone heat with her bare hands and spoke to walls as if they could answer was the most interesting person he had met in 17 years of a life he had previously considered adequate. The McElmo Children's House opened in the autumn of 1889, 2 years after Mara crawled out of a coal shed with a terrier under her coat. The building was a converted ranch house donated by a widow named Lutz, who had lost her husband to a logging accident and her taste for isolated property. Vowell supervised the renovation. Mara directed the winter preparation. The building faced south. The north wall was double thick, packed with mud and straw between the courses. The sleeping rooms were small, deep, insulated by the outer rooms from wind. River stones lined the south-facing window wells. A proper stove with a sound chimney heated the main hall, but the sleeping rooms relied on stone heat and ceiling. Not because fire was forbidden, but because Mara had learned that fire was a supplement, not a solution, and that a room which depended entirely on fire was a room that would fail when the fire failed. The Children's House had rules. No child would be placed with a family without a 2-month trial period during which the child could return without penalty. No unpaid labor contracts. No confiscation of personal belongings, including animals. Every child over 10 would learn sheltercraft, sealing drafts, storing food, reading weather, understanding which wall held heat and which wall spent it. And every child would be told on their first day that the knowledge came from people who had lived in the canyon long before any settler arrived, and that respect for those people was not optional. Mara ran the sheltercraft lessons herself. She stood in the yard each morning and made children press their palms to both walls. She made them throw ash to read wind. She made them fill tin cups with water and place them in different rooms overnight, then check which had frozen and which had not. She made them feel the difference between a stone that had seen sun and a stone that had not, and she told them what her father had told her in a rail cut in St. Louis. The rock remembers. The children responded the way children respond to competence demonstrated rather than authority imposed. They believed her because her methods worked, not because she told them to believe. Ludi, whose cough was gone, became Mara's most devoted student. She followed Mara through the building with a stub of charcoal and a piece of board, marking sun patches on the floor the way Mara had marked them in the cliff dwelling. She was 9 years old, and she understood thermal mass better than any adult in the valley because she had felt it save her life. Ada took a different path. She had watched Mara teach and had absorbed the principles, but her gift was not hands, it was language. She could explain what Mara demonstrated. When a ranch wife looked confused by the idea of moving stones from windowsills to sleeping pallets, Ada translated, "It's an iron you heat on the stove and wrap in cloth for your bed. Same idea, just bigger, and the sun does the heating instead of the stove." People understood Ada because Ada understood people, and together, Mara and Ada became a teaching pair that reached families. Mara's seriousness alone would have lost. Vowel completed his transformation from authority skeptic to quiet advocate over the course of that first full winter in the children's house. He checked widows' cabins for north wall leaks before first snow. He carried river stones to 3 families whose homes were too far from the wash to collect their own. He never used the word passive solar. He said, "The Bellamy method," which embarrassed Mara and which she could not stop him from saying because Vowel was a man who had made up his mind and did not unmake it. The results were measurable. That winter, the children's house used 40% less firewood than the orphanage had used the previous year with the same number of occupants. No child developed the blue-lipped symptoms that Ludi had shown during the storm. The sleeping rooms maintained temperatures above freezing through every night, including the 3-day cold snap in January, when the wash froze solid and 2 cattle died on the mesa. The valley noticed. Not everyone. Not the men who had believed Quill or the families who resented being taught by a girl who was not yet 17. But enough. Enough to carry the knowledge forward through the next winter and the one after that. Mara married Jonah Rusk in the spring of 1895. She was 23. He was 25. The wedding was at the church hall where she had first laid river stones in the window wells, and Bristle, 11 years old and gray-muzzled and slow, slept on the front pew through the ceremony. The courtship had been long and careful, built not on declarations but on shared work. Jonah printed the winter preparedness notices each autumn, updating them with new details Mara added. How to calculate the thickness of mud needed for a north wall, how to size a sleeping room for a family of 4, how to read cloud patterns for coming cold. He never told Mara what the notices should say. He asked what she wanted them to say and set the type. Their partnership worked because it was built on the same principle that held the cliff dwelling together. Each element doing the work it was suited for, without competing for the same function. Mara understood stone and heat and the physical mechanics of survival. Jonah understood words and distribution and the particular stubbornness of people who would not change their habits unless the case was made in language they trusted. Mara knew what to teach. Jonah knew how to make it travel. They fought sometimes. About whether to expand the children's house, about whether Mara was working herself into the kind of exhaustion that her father had died from, about whether Jonah spent too many hours at the press and not enough with the children. The fights were real, but short. Neither of them had the patience for sustained anger when there was work to be done. They had 2 children, a son born in 1897 and a daughter born in 1900. Mara taught both of them to press their palms to stone before they could read. The son grew up to be a carpenter who built south-facing houses without being told why. The daughter grew up to be a teacher who pinned a faded copy of the winter preparedness notice to every classroom wall she ever occupied. Bristle died in the winter of 1898, curled on the stone bench in the main room of the house Mara and Jonah had built on the south slope above the wash. The house had south-facing windows, thick north walls, a stone bench along the interior wall that stayed warm after sunset, and a door frame where Bristle's collar hung for the next 33 years. Mara buried him on the ridge where she could see the cliff face from above. She did not mark the grave with a stone because Bristle had never needed markers to find what mattered. The years compressed the way years do when the daily work is steady, and the crises are smaller but no less real. The McElmo Children's House operated for 18 years under Mara's guidance and Vowell's oversight, until Vowell's death in 1907 at the age of 81. In that time, the house sheltered over 90 children. Some were placed with families. Some aged out and found work. Some stayed and became part of the operation, Ludi among them, painting a small red cliff on the schoolroom wall that she repainted every spring until the plaster beneath it crumbled. Mara never took visitors to the hidden cliff dwelling. When the Mesa Verde ruins became a national park in 1906, she supported the preservation effort quietly and anonymously, sending money when she had it and silence when she did not. The hidden alcove remained hidden. Mara did not know whether Talwai had survived her illness or not. The distance between their worlds was too wide for the kind of casual inquiry that settler society permitted. But she kept the woven cord on her wrist until the fibers wore thin and the braid loosened, and she replaced it with a new cord she braided herself from wool she bought at the trading post, because the gesture mattered more than the original material. She became, in her later years, a woman that people in the valley described with a single phrase, the one who knows about walls. Ranch wives asked her advice before building. Carpenters consulted her on orientation. A government surveyor passing through in 1912 asked her how she had learned passive solar principles, and Mara said, "A Dene woman named Talwai Yazi taught me to listen to stone. People who lived in these canyons 600 years ago showed me what to do with what I heard." The surveyor wrote this down. Whether it survived in any record, Mara did not know and did not pursue. She and Jonah lived in the south-facing house above the wash for the rest of their lives. Jonah's press-printed notices, school materials, church bulletins, and once a year, a fresh run of the winter preparedness handbill that had been his first collaboration with Mara. The handbill changed over the years, new details added, old ones refined, but the first two lines never changed. South wall receives sun. Face your living space south. Mara's health declined in her 50s. The winters she had survived in the cliff and the years of physical labor, carrying stones, packing walls, climbing canyon trails to check on isolated families, had worn her body in the specific ways that frontier life wore every body that served it honestly. Her lungs, never strong after the coal shed night and the smoke-filled orphanage, troubled her through her last winters. She coughed when the air turned dry. She rested when she could, which was not often. She had 2 rules painted inside her pantry door, in the careful lettering Jonah had taught her. Stop the wind first. Need is not ownership. The first was the lesson the cliff had given her. The second was the lesson Talwai had given her. Together, they were the frame she had built her life inside. As functional and deliberate as the south-facing walls she taught others to build. As specific as the charcoal marks she had drawn on the floor of a hidden room at 15 years old, measuring where the sun went so she could use what it left behind. Mara Bellamy died in February of 1931 at 59, after a winter of lung trouble that the valley doctor called pneumonia, and that Mara called the last draft I couldn't seal. She died in the stone-walled house above the wash, in a room with south-facing windows and a bench that held warmth after sunset. Bristle's collar hung over the door. The woven cord, rebraided for the 4th time, circled her wrist. Jonah sat beside her with his hand on hers, and the last thing she felt was the warmth of his skin, which was the same kind of warmth the stone gave, slow, patient, earned by hours of facing the right direction. Within 5 winters of Mara's first demonstration in the church cellar, 23 families in the McElmo Canyon Valley had adopted some version of what she taught. South-facing sleeping rooms, riverstone heat banks under window wells, mud-packed north walls, raised pallets with air gaps, emergency food caches stored above floor level in sealed rooms, wind baffles over every north-facing crack. The knowledge spread the way practical knowledge always spreads on a frontier, not through institutions or publications, but through one woman pressing another woman's palm to a warm wall and saying, "Feel that." The printed notices Jonah Rusk produced each autumn became the Valley's most requested single sheet of paper, carried in saddlebags and tacked to cabin walls from McElmo to Dolores. Mara lived her remaining years close enough to the canyon to see the cliffs turn red at evening, but far enough to never betray the hidden entrance to anyone who asked. She kept no journal. She sought no credit. She left behind a stone house that faced south, a children's home that sheltered 90 lives, a printing press that carried 7 rules on rough paper to families she never met, and 2 sentences painted inside a pantry door that said everything she had learned in a voice so plain it could not be misunderstood. In November of 1887, Vernon Quill locked a 15-year-old girl in a coal shed and told the marshal that one less stubborn girl would save coal. He told the town to let the canyon teach her obedience. The canyon did teach her, but not obedience. It taught her that stone holds what the sun gives if the wind is stopped first. It taught her that shelter can be older than any town office and outlast any man's ledger. It taught her that survival is not fire. Survival is knowing where the heat already lives and building your walls around it. In a sandstone alcove 38 feet deep with a terrier pressed against her ribs and the worst November storm in a decade screaming past the cliff face, Mara Bellamy put her palm to the back wall and felt warmth. She was 15 years old. She had no fire, no food, no blanket, and no person in the valley who would have bet a $50 on her life. The stone was warm. She lived.